double check with Nick and see if we're actually on. Okay, Nick, I think we're good.
Recording in progress.
There we go. Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the October 18th joint meeting of the Budget Task Force, the Select Board, School Committee, and the Finance Committee meeting. We'll start, as we always do, with the Pledge of Allegiance, led by Scott.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So I will call the, let's see.
I'm getting a few people promoted.
Yeah, we're just going to take 1 second, everybody, to promote everybody to panelists, and then once we can see that we have quorum, we'll call to order first Select Board, then School Committee, then Finance Committee. And while we're doing that, if you're tuning in, I just want to mention something about the town meeting on Monday. We've gotten a lot of feedback. Clearly, that was not the experience for town meeting that anyone would have wanted. We understand that between the traffic, the parking, the check-in process, some confusion just all around, that was not a good town meeting experience. We're working very hard to compile all of your feedback. We value your feedback. Please send it if you have feedback to send. We're putting all of that together. I know that Angela Harkness, our moderator, and our town council, and Kristen and other town staff have been working many hours the past couple of days to make sure we've got a good, clear sight on the things that we need to fix to make sure we do deliver you that really high-quality, accessible town meeting experience that we're committed to. So we hear you. We understand that that was not acceptable, and we're hard at work on making sure the next time we have that meeting, it really lives up to everyone's expectations. So please send along your comments if you have them. It's very important and very helpful to us. How are we doing on?
Sure. So for
meeting?
select board members, we have John Cunningham and Chris Barrett on Zoom, and Scott Hazelton and you, Tom,
Okay.
here.
Great.
So
So
we do
I'll
have a
call the
quorum of the select board.
Great. Thank you, Kristen. I'll call the select board to order.
For school committee, there's no members on Zoom.
Yep, we have a quorum in person, so I'll call to order this meeting of the school committee.
And for finance committee, we have Hari Vesta and Shelby McLeod as panelists. I continue to try to ask Tom LaFlamme to be promoted to panelist. He now has his hand raised, so we're working on, Tom is listening. He's
Okay.
on the Zoom. And I
So
think he just got promoted to
That covers
panelist.
us for 5, so I'll call the finance committee to order.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So the order of business tonight is to formally present the Budget Task Force report. If anyone would like to take a look, it's a really comprehensive document. I think it's going to be a very valuable tool for everybody in terms of just basic understanding and budget planning. We'll go through it tonight, and you'll hear some of the voices that helped to work on it present tonight. And then we'll have some discussion. We'll have an opportunity for any kind of public questions and also questions from the board. We'll do questions from the boards first and then public questions when we're through. First, I'd just like to introduce everybody who is part of the effort and just to thank them again publicly for the many hours they put in. So I was on the committee.
Publicly call the budget task force to order.
We certainly can. So, yeah, so let's go ahead and call the Budget Task Force to order. We have a quorum here, certainly. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank the co-chair, Valerie Young, and also the editor-in-chief of the final document, which is a Herculean task, so thank you, Valerie. Chris Chu, our superintendent. Thank you, Chris. Shanna Farnsworth, who you'll hear from tonight, did an enormous amount of research on a wide range of subjects. Christina Green, our finance committee chair. Thank you, Christina. Vibhu Jain, who's not with us tonight. He's traveling in business in Asia tonight, but he provided a lot of excellent insight in terms of benchmarking and analysis and graphic representation. Kristen, our town manager. Jenny Lynn, our school finance director. Dan, our town finance director. Erica Cole, and Amy Lundquist, who both served as alternates but really participated as full members, definitely taking their share of analysis work and presentation. And we'll All of us will be available to answer any kind of questions you have. So first, just thank you for all the time put in on this over the past, boy, when did we start? 3 or 4 months, so it's been intense. So let's go ahead and start with the presentation deck, if we might. This is us. So tonight we're going to follow roughly what's in the executive summary of the document. If you've read that, we're going to be basically following through in close order to what was covered in the executive summary. Everything that we'll talk about has between a paragraph and several pages of detailed analysis in the document itself. We'll be happy to answer any questions, but we may also refer you to the document if we feel like that will help clarify some things. So that includes review of budget challenges, update on revenue opportunities, benchmarking, efficiency possibilities, recommendations. One thing that came out of this study after looking at how many other towns do things was some examples of things we thought could be continuous improvement opportunities for us in the way we do things here in Westford, so we'll talk about some of those. And then next steps both for the committee and then after we've answered all the questions about the budget task force itself, we'll touch basically on next steps in the budget process. This is an excellent graphic that Erica developed. You saw this before if you've been to this meeting before, but does a good job outlining all the different sort of elements of work that went into this. I'll just spend a second on it. So lots of detailed analysis with data from many comparable communities. Christina will explain to you a little bit more about what that was and how it worked. Drawing on all previous documents to make sure we had grabbed any learnings from them. We had several listening sessions. We participated in the strategic retreat, and really we were able to communicate with everybody and get feedback. Everyone who's at the retreat, get feedback and questions. Extensive interviews with staff, extensive interviews with other peer communities if we felt like they had something important to teach us. A lot of that information then was boiled down in terms of the analysis that's in the report now. And we did a little bit of work sort of exploring what some of the different scenarios might be, some of the impacts might be to us trying to achieve all the requirements in our budget using the resources available in the Prop 2.5 normal new growth and Prop 2.5 growth. So lots of discussions and much gratitude to town staff in particular for all the time they put into this. I know it was an enormous amount of work for them to supply us the information that we needed, but again, I think it'll be very, very valuable to do. Okay, so this next section Dan is going to present. Dan was one of the captains on the budget challenge team. So Dan, if you could take us through some of the highlights.
Sure. Actually, Dr. Chu and I are going to share these slides here and switch back and forth, but I'm going to review all the budget challenges on the next four slides here. This is not the total projected budget increase, but rather the issues that are increasing more than expected, which is contributing to the projected deficit. To keep perspective on the estimates we are providing, in a given year, the town usually sees about $3 million in new general fund revenue. So when you're looking at these increases, please just keep that in mind. Both the recycling and solid waste contracts are expiring at the end of the fiscal year. Acme, who has been our provider since 1989, will no longer be providing services for us, so thank you to Acme for all those years of dedication to Westford. We knew we would have a substantial increase once Acme stopped providing those services based on other bids we solicited over the years. And we found out after the last budget was passed that they would no longer be putting in a bid for us. We currently have 2 proposals that the Select Board and Recycling Commission are considering. We'll see about a $500,000 cost increase with the lower cost proposal in FY25. However, the future year increases are a little bit more reasonable, about $75,000 per year. Moving down, next we have utility costs. Our supply contract for natural gas is expiring in February. We locked in rates for a 3-year period, and rates are going up 70% in the next contract. We did lock in right at the very bottom of the market last time we had a contract, so that's the reason for the substantial increase. The estimated costs for the natural gas supply is about $238,000. We also have our electricity supply contract expiring on November 30th of 2024, so in another year. Costs are expected to increase by almost $300,000 per year, with about a 40% increase on that. So overall, the contracts are actually staggered over a couple fiscal years, but the gross increase is going to be about $537,000 from these new contracts per year. All right, moving on. See, next up is town and school collectively bargain contracts. Basically, labor is our biggest component. Government is a service industry. And in order to meet our target for competitive pay, these are our cost estimates for labor contracts coming up. We do extensive market research when it comes to settling contracts, and we have a market of over 20 communities on the town side. For FY25, the only contract expiring is the firefighters. And then FY26, we have the other 5 unions expiring. We have an estimated cost in there of about $831,000 FY25 and $808,000 for FY26. So I'm going to pause and hand it over to Dr. Chu.
Sure. So we, as you can see there, our Unit B and our Unit E. Unit B, which is our coordinators and team leaders, and then our teaching assistants, who are also education support professionals. Unit E, we have tentative agreements with both of those. Units that we're working on all the MOAs right now, and then that'll be brought to the school committee. Our custodian contract is settled through FY25, and we were able to settle our teacher and nurse contract at the beginning of this school year, so that's settled now through FY26. And when we looked at all of the different contracts and the needs, if you remember again from the beginning of the slide, looking at our target for competitive pay, the needs in FY25 and the needs in FY26 are listed there, that we would need an increase of $3.3 million in FY25 and $3.4 million in FY26.
Great. And then the last section on this slide is the town employee non-union salaries. We have non-union personnel on the town side that's mostly composed of department heads and other confidential staff that are in the accounting and HR departments. We're constantly comparing salaries to other communities in order to retain our excellent staff. We don't have a lot of turnover in that area. The estimated increase for non-union staff is about $194K in FY25 and $202,000 in FY26. All right, next up we have the health insurance trust here. We became partially self-insured back in March of 2022, and since that time our claims have been running very poorly. They've increased over 20% per year over the past 2 years, which our health insurance broker, who's been in the business over 30 years, said he has never seen this before. So this is sort of unprecedented. We actually ended FY23 with a negative balance of $387,000, which we have legally we have to fund, so we are raising that in the FY24 tax rate. We also supplemented Monday night at the special town meeting the FY24 budget by $950,000. And that was necessary because the health insurance trust voted to increase rates by 15% effective November 1st. So it's quite a burden on employees as well. Our broker did recommend a 22% because of the shape we're in, but we thought that was just too far with our employees at this point in time. We're expecting an increase of almost $1.5 million to the budget in FY25 and another $1.9 million to the FY26 budget. But these are just projections that were provided by our broker. It's very hard to predict how health claims are going to run. So we're going to keep an eye on this from month to month and update accordingly. And then below this, we have the bus contract. Staff has written an RFP to solicit proposals. We're actually sending it out next Monday. Based on what other towns are seeing, they're seeing at least an 11% increase in their bids. So that's what we're sort of projecting here. An 11% increase would be about $444,000 in FY25, another $250,000 in FY26. So we can update this once we get the bids back as well.
I'll just mention that this is not, you still got another slide.
Oh, yeah, one more.
Okay.
Last one. I'll hand over to Dr. Shu again.
Yeah, so one of our challenges, we know that our special education fleet of vans that we currently have 18 vans, and as you can see, the leases are all out of date. We have a number of vans that have high mileage that has contributed to higher maintenance costs, and so we are working on a plan to begin cycling through There was a time when we were bringing so many vans on board to try to make sure that the entire fleet didn't end up in this situation. COVID complicated that for us, and the availability of vehicles. So we have some that have higher maintenance. We're going to try to replace those first with newer vehicles, and we're also exploring the possibility of supplementing some of the fleet with electric vans as well too. We don't have the actual bids in place. We do know that in order to renew, I think it's three of the vans for FY25, the increase is $132,000. So that's what that number is coming at right there, because we're going to look to try to renew 3 to 4 vans over the next 3 years, so that we have a cycle again, trying to make sure that we don't end up with high mileage vehicles. The next section is about the special education tuition. So something that we had talked about in preparing for the FY24 budget was the fact that the operational services division was allowed to increase all special education private tuitions by up to 14%. There was a long period of time when we didn't know if they were actually going to go up to the 14%, but they did. And so in FY24, that is part of the budget that we developed for this year, but we're using one-time funds to cover that cost. And so we know that that's now going to be a cost that will be a part of FY25 and FY26. Now, historically, we have estimated our special education costs increasing by, you can see on the slide, 3.3%. So that is something that we've just always considered. We also know now that that for FY25, some of the costs are already going to be increasing at 4.69%, I believe it is. And so when we added all of that together, the costs that we knew that we had built into FY24 and what it'll mean for FY25, the cost is now $1.2 million.
This is a good time to ask any questions of Dan, if you have, Dan or Dr. Chu, if you have them. We did not intend this to be a comprehensive catalog of all increased costs. There'll be other things that will increase too. What we tried to do, though, is anything that was a major budget line item that was scheduled to grow or forecast to grow much faster than 2.5% to 3%, which is a more typical budget increase. Those are what we spotlighted here. So if you sum up everything that's here, that would not be the totality of what's going on with the budget. We did not forecast what was going to happen with many, many other things that typically have moved with inflation as well. So just to let people know, it's not a comprehensive catalog. I wouldn't just add these numbers up and think, okay, that's the budget change. That will be the work of the committees here going forward in the budget process. Any questions? Any questions online?
I don't see anything online right now.
No. And again, there's lots more in the document itself. Each sort of bullet here typically has a paragraph or more of support to kind of go into the detail of how the mechanics work.
Scott has a question.
That's not a question, just observation that, while we may be self-insured for health insurance, insurance companies don't make any money by losing money, right? So if we have a bad claim performance, as we have had, whether we were self-insured or not, we'd be looking at those rate. It's a question of how do you pay the rate increase, right? Do we pay ourselves or do we pay an insurance premium? Either way, that cost is going to happen given our experience. Just want to make that clear that it's not a funding problem. It's a experience rating problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So it may look like this path is costing more, but there's no reason to think over time that this path for insurance will cost more than the alternative. Another point that I don't want to put words in Scott's mouth, but one way of thinking about a lot of these increases is if you have contracts that were negotiated either with longtime historical vendors or in a low inflation environment, and you have a lot of these contracts ending and getting rebid all at once in a higher inflation environment, that's exactly the perfect storm for seeing, these substantial jumps in sort of baseline costs for each of these major contracts. The special education situation is a little bit different. There was sort of artificially suppressed for a long time, and then they needed a relief valve to be able to cover their increased costs. So you have this sudden approval of a much bigger increase than you would typically see. So similar in dynamic, but a little bit different because it was sort of legislatively created. Okay. One of the things that we spent a fair amount of time on was looking at what other towns do and what we might do in terms of new potential revenue. And Shannon was the leader of that team, so Shannon, if you could take us through that.
So for potential revenue opportunities, the Budget Task Force had investigated various new sources of revenue to offset the impact of the budget challenges we just discussed. We also reviewed existing revenue sources as well to see if there was any place we might make an adjustment that would increase revenue. Here you see a list of the opportunities that we investigated. There are in-depth details of our research and our findings on each one of these topics in the final report, as Tom has indicated. We're pages 61 to 87 in case anyone wants some light reading on revenue. I won't go through them all because we've discussed some of them before, but they are here and again listed in the report. So based on all of our research and our findings, the Budget Task Force made these conclusions after the completion of all of the research on these opportunities. Many of the listed opportunities ended up not to be viable due to existing laws, feasibility, current fee structures, market comparisons. So there were many on that list in the previous page that were dead ends, basically. For the few that had potential for a larger revenue impact outside of a Proposition 2.5 override, those opportunities were not going to produce revenue quick enough to impact the current budget challenges for FY24 and 25. There were a few revenue opportunities that could have a fairly immediate impact on near-term budgets. However, most of these near-term opportunities are only low to medium revenue gains. That being said, there certainly are opportunities that the task force recommends for further investigation, which could generate increased revenue. So there is some hope here. It's important just to note, though, that the task force charge was to review these opportunities with an impartial eye and focus mostly on the financial piece and the financial impact. So these opportunities we're discussing that for recommendation were for boards to further engage and explore and consider, not necessarily that we're endorsing them or recommending them to be implemented. So I just wanted to note that. We did look at everything from a very high level financial impact and not necessarily we should or shouldn't do something, but just what should be recommended from a financial and fiscal perspective. So what do we recommend for further consideration? So starting here with our near-term revenue opportunities, I'll share with you just an overview of our findings. Again, there are more details on each one of these in the report. So the first one was the pay-as-you-throw solid waste program. I think as most people know this, we are, as Dan just talked about, renegotiating the contracts. So in this determination of how the new program will be rolled out, the select board could consider the budget challenges we have in the increased cost of the waste contract when they're deciding whether or not to include resident charges for trash. As you'll be able to see in some of the documentation, many peer communities offset some of their trash costs by charging residents for a percentage of what they're throwing away. There are also a few peer communities that pass the entire cost of trash to the resident and have no trash costs to the town. Cannabis excise tax. The select board could further consider whether the town may want to revisit allowing recreational cannabis retail. There is a considerable amount of new information that show less community impact than originally anticipated when this law first came out in 2019. Westford residents who are purchasing recreational cannabis are going to our bordering towns, which is bolstering tax revenue for the neighboring communities that could essentially become tax revenue for Westford. And I know just in particular that that's a difficult topic, so there is a lot of research in our report if somebody wants to dive in a little bit more to some of the information that we dug up. Another topic was increased facility rentals. So the town could look for other town-owned spaces that we could utilize as rental and revenue opportunities. There are certainly groups in town that are looking for lower cost meeting spaces. We know like Girl Scouts and Cub Scouts and all different kinds of recreational activities. So there's definitely a need for more space. The schools have successfully started a program recently that has started to generate some revenue for the school budget. So one of the things is that the schools could advertise their rental capabilities a little bit more to the general public to help increase revenue there. Another item included in this particular bucket is ensuring that our rentals in our leased buildings are being contracted at market rates, and that the town is ensuring we're being competitive with our rental spaces. Ambulance fees was another area that we looked at. We had determined, based on some of the research that Christina did on our comparable communities, that our ambulance rates might not be in line with some of those other communities. We noted several communities that had higher revenue numbers. So through conversations with the fire department and the task force, the FD did determine that it made sense to increase ambulance rates, and this actually has already happened. And the FD will continue to revisit their rates on a yearly basis or as needed to ensure that we remain competitive in the market. Reviewing of other fees. Currently, our departments and boards and commissions charge fees for certain aspects of their operations, and those fees should be reviewed in a systemic fashion to ensure that the town is charging rates that are consistent with our market communities and are also covering the cost of the service that we are providing. Another near-term opportunity is the possibility of a Proposition 2.5 override, which the town could consider. So looking at some of those longer-term revenue opportunities, these were ones that predominantly, there were a few that would come in at a higher revenue amount, but again, would take longer to come to fruition. So the first one, as I think is pretty typical, is economic development. This continues to be a large piece of adding revenue to our tax roll. The town could ensure that we're best positioned to attract economic development by making sure we have correct zoning areas, we have adequate facilities, and we have favorable conditions for prospective developers to want to come and build buildings or occupy buildings in town. Another topic in the community right now is the MBTA Multifamily Zoning Act. This initiative has a very strong opportunity to bring significant revenue growth to the town. So the town could be working with residents and developers to carve out the option for the zoning that will work best for Westford from both a development perspective and from a revenue generation perspective. And for solar installations, the select board could continue to evaluate using solar energy to offset energy costs. With solar installations, there is the ability to generate electricity such that utility bill savings can be applied to other energy projects. And while this may not actually impact revenue per se from a growth perspective, it does remove energy expenses from our annual operating budget, and that will have long-term benefits for their budgeting. Also from a longer-term revenue opportunity are cell tower rentals. We do only currently have one cell tower rental in town, and it is a decent way to add revenue with not a lot of fanfare. So the select board, as they come up before them, any opportunities for cell tower rentals, we could consider those to generate a little bit of extra revenue. And then last on our longer term list was a composting program. So the town could work with a composting company to arrange for a reduced cost composting program for residents. The more residents are doing for composting, the greater chance that we can reduce our overall waste disposal. And then over time, that will allow for some cost reduction in our waste disposal services.
So why don't we pause there again, just like we did with Dan, and if anyone has any question related to the new revenue, as Shannon mentioned, many of them, we sort of came to a conclusion that that there wasn't much of an opportunity there. The explanation of what we did and why that conclusion was reached is in the document, but certainly happy to answer any questions if people have them now.
So Tom Laflamme of the Finance Committee has a question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom.
No problem. So everything looks great. The one thing I do want to caution, and I had an issue with the wording in the report itself, was on the solid waste. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say sharing the cost or pay as you throw, because ultimately the tax base is, the residents are already paying that cost for waste removal. So it's just something I want to be aware of how we're wording it. It's not sharing it, it's shifting something that is in the tax base to a fee. And that's a concern I've had all along. So I just want to raise that.
Yeah, absolutely right. So if the town did a pay-as-you-throw, it's basically transferring what has historically been borne by the town to the residents. So absolutely a fair point. It does show up to the resident in just a different way.
I would, oh, go ahead.
I was add to that, you know, from my opinion, if we were to pursue a pay-as-you-throw, that's basically back to override. So I would like to think that goes to a town meeting vote, not a select board and a FinCom vote, but the town gets to weigh in on that, because it is a tax increase effectively. I guess my other thought was, though, that we have a budget problem now and next year, and so I think the incentive is to focus on the short-term revenue problems, but we're here because of the long-term revenue problems, right? So if we don't fix things like our economic mix, we're going to be here again in 5 years. So I think we need to think about the economic development. It may not pay us back in 2 years, or the you know, the development of more housing. You know, that doesn't pay back in 2 years, but it makes us better positioned for 5 and 10 years, that we don't have to, you know, be here again.
Yeah, another excellent point, that we want to keep up focus on that. And it's in the document. For those of you that aren't going to have an opportunity to read the document, the town has basically created funding for an economic development consultant that's working closely with the Economic Development Committee, and that report will give us a good sort of outlay of where the opportunities are, what the opportunity gaps are, what the things we can do to close that gap are. So we're going to have new information to act on when that report is through, and it'll certainly come back before the Select Board and others to make sure we do act on it.
I'd also just like to note that the MBTA Multifamily Housing Committee will be hosting a forum next week on the 26th at 6:30 at Stony Brook School to gather feedback and information. So we do note it here as potential revenue. We would definitely encourage any resident or property owner or any other interested party to attend that meeting next week.
Another thing we do in the document is give estimates of what we think the possible revenue opportunities are here. So if you're interested in sort of, you know, getting a yardstick, like how much money are we talking about, there are some estimates that are there for people to review.
And they're in the low, medium, high, not necessarily specific dollar amounts.
Okay, thanks.
Also, the composting program is like a three-fer. You know, one is you reduce your cost of trash disposal. Obviously, you help the environment because you are reusing stuff that is currently being burned. But the worst thing you can do with a trash energy plant is give it food waste, which consumes more energy to burn than you can get out of it from burning it. And thirdly, a lot of folks right now are paying good money to get compost for gardens that they could be getting for free or lower cost if we composted it. So that's got a lot of attractive merits.
One thing we've asked from the Recycling Commission is their help and advice on how we can do an education campaign around waste reduction generally. That'll be a topic that's going on. And later in this presentation, Christina will share a little bit about how Westford looks relative to other towns like us in terms of trash. But the spoiler is that it's we bring a lot more to the curb than our neighbors do. So there's a real opportunity there. Any other questions or comments on the revenue opportunities before we shift gears? Okay. Christina, I think
we've.
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Diane, please come to the mic, if you would.
Naive question. I know between now and town meeting, obviously there's a lot of work to be done, and you guys will get into details. What happened, and you'll negotiate and talk to the teams and talk to the departments. By some fluke, what happens if at town meeting the budget that's presented is not accepted? I know that sounds naive and negative, but what's the process? Thank you, that's all.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about the path we're going to take in the budgeting process from here, Diane. And maybe if you don't mind, we can address that topic then, because the chairs and vice chairs have met, and there's sort of a proposal for us to take back to our individual boards about how we might approach this budget process, and that might give a little bit of color on what might happen. Okay. So Christina, I think, is going to lead us maybe with some help from other people who are on this team through the benchmarking and inefficiencies.
Sure. So, as we've said several times, we benchmarked ourselves against several other communities, and the list really broke down into two different lists: one for the school department and one for the town side departments. Excuse me. I'm not going to go through this again. It just more for reference that we use these two different lists of communities to benchmark ourselves against. So, we'll go to the next. So this is for the municipal departments. If you went to the strategic retreat, this will look somewhat familiar. It has expanded a little bit because we had a little more real estate here to show a further breakdown. So I'm just going to go through some of these kind of briefly. There's a lot of detail in the report, obviously, on each of these areas. I'll call your attention to a couple of things. So the library. These numbers are different than the numbers that were on the handout in the strategic retreat. And the reason being, we were still in the analysis phase. And what we realized after speaking to Ellen Rainville, who's the head of the library, that libraries are held to different standards based on population sizes. So we didn't think it was fair to compare our library to that whole 22 town list when there are there's different requirements on the libraries. So we narrowed the list for the library to Acton, Concord, Stoneham, Sudbury, and Westwood, they're all within our population range from the Massachusetts Library Board of Commissioners. So we're all under the same constraints. So our library per capita actually spends $75. The average of those 6 communities, including us, is $99. So our library is actually a little, more efficient than its peers. One thing to note, though, we're open sort of on the lower end of number of hours, and our personnel count is a little high. There are some reasons why that happens. It's kind of the setup of our library. There's lots of little different nooks and crannies, and you've got to have people there. You can't kind of have less personnel handling that big space. Recreation, sure. Yeah.
It just occurred to me that I was a part of a library meeting on Monday, and with the new library, we'll have like an automated checkout system. Mm-hmm. So again, it's a sort of short-term saving, but long-term, do we actually get some labor reductions? Do we think
there could be? Amy, do you happen to remember if Ellen mentioned that or not with the new library?
I hadn't discussed an automatic checkout. I think,
okay.
Portions of that is the staffing is safety and availability of staff, but we didn't get into that piece.
It's certainly something to watch going forward with the new library, exactly. So on to recreation. We are a little bit higher than other communities, and our rec department is a little unique, perhaps. There are several towns who have really large recreation facilities. There were 4 on our benchmark list of Lexington, Concord, Belmont, and Burlington, and they end up with a zero cost to the taxpayer because they have huge facilities. They have pools. They have a lot of user fees that offset that. We're not quite in that category. There are other towns that have over the past few years have done away with their rec departments, and they have very little staff to just take care of if they have a beach or maybe they have a park or something. It's very minimal. The health department, we are just a little bit higher than the average. It's $19 per capita versus the $17 average. I'll leave it at that because if I start going into details, I don't want to take up time. It's all in the report. Council on Aging, we are a little bit higher, and the interesting point there is we're actually on the lower end of our population percentage of people over 65 is actually on the lower end of our peer communities, but yet we're spending on the higher end. So there's just there's some interesting things to look at there. Our Department of Public Works is actually very efficient. You can see $126 per capita versus the $187 average. And the kicker to this is that we're like number 3 in road miles, or 2 or something. So we have a lot of road miles that our DPW has to take care of, and they're doing, you know, a pretty phenomenal job. Police department, you'll notice, is a little bit higher than the average. It's 253 per capita versus 240. But again, interesting note, there were at least 3 or 4 communities on our list that currently are spending less than us per capita, who had said in their FY24 budget documents that they were actually looking at increasing their staffing on their police departments. So they would be more in line with Westford's police personnel. So yes, we're spending a little bit more right now, but it seems like other towns are going to be increasing because they realize that they're a little short. Dispatch, we are on the higher end, and it, you know, it was sort of interesting because the piece that we couldn't really get to is a real apples to apples comparison on the number and types of calls that we receive versus other communities. And so that was kind of the missing link there to sort of maybe shed some light on why we're spending more per capita than other towns. The other thing that is very difficult about, I'll say, all of public safety, actually police, dispatch, and fire, is the way towns organize those departments. Dispatch is sometimes in the police budget, and when I was going through trying to pull apart police and dispatch, sometimes I could do it very easily, and sometimes I could not. So there's a little bit of a margin of error in those. With the fire department, that could sometimes be very tightly coupled with ambulance, and so the same kind of issue sort of came up there. Going on to fire department, you know, you'll notice that we are significantly lower than the average at $179 per capita versus the $237 average. Part of that is because of our ambulance, so we could be a little artificially low there, but we do have the ambulance personnel there to, you know, help
How
out.
did you factor in, so you've got the fire budget, you've also got the enterprise fund from the ambulance, so is the cost total, or is it?
So this fire is just the fire department because in, at least for our budget, the ambulance revenue, you know, the ambulance is totally separate, but they do share personnel, so it gets a little muddied there. I didn't try to do that. That's why it might look a little artificially low.
Let's say with DPW, does that include water and DPW, or is it?
No, I tried to exclude the enterprise funds because they should be self-sustaining, and water doesn't, you know, not everybody uses the water department in town.
And we have no town sewer, some towns do, so that would.
Which also muddied things when I was trying to do comparisons, but I checked with Steve on some of those, so just to make sure, just to keep me honest.
So before we move on to the next slide or any questions, Ellen Rainville has her hand raised. She might have a clarifying question or
Okay.
comment related to the library.
Yep, welcome, Ellen.
Ellen, can you hear us? She muted herself, so she's coming on as a panelist. Go ahead, Ellen. You're on mute. There you go.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. It took me a few minutes to get unmuted. But there are self-checkout stations in the new library, and we will be reducing from 5 service stations in the future library down to 3. So we definitely will see an ability to be holding down personnel.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. Very helpful. Yep, Heather?
Before you move on, I did start reading your report in depth today, and I did have Council on Aging jump out at me for the same thing that you said with the demographics of our community being kid-heavy and not elderly-heavy. But I also wanted to ask, I was surprised by the Department of Public Works. Did you cover the asphalt settlement and Chapter 90 funds? Did they all?
So I did not try to get in there, yeah.
We did talk about those in
We
the
did.
report, though.
Yep, but we didn't try to add that back in and recalculate or anything.
Right, so if that settlement amount in asphalt had to show up here as a cost, you're right. That would make it higher.
It might, right.
Yep, Sean?
I have a quick question. So regarding dispatch, there's a quick line about how some local communities are regionalized.
Mhm.
Was there any discussion as to that and what type of cost savings would be associated with it?
So when we went through the benchmarking, we really just sort of noted what other communities were doing. So whether they were regionalized or not, or they were looking into it, we really didn't go further into studying that to see whether there would be a savings, whether it was feasible, whether it wasn't. We left that as a possible recommendation to
Got it.
town staff to look into.
And I would add too, I think part of it was time constraint. We
Yeah.
didn't really have
Yeah.
the time to
Yeah.
be able to dig into some of that
Yeah.
stuff as in-depthly as maybe if we had had another 3 months
Year.
to, yeah, or a year. But I think that was part of it too.
Yeah, I think part of the handoff will be sort of, these are some interesting things maybe to explore, and then during the budgeting process, we'll all have a chance to ask those questions again. So we'll have a chance to come back to dispatch and say, are we making the right trade-offs here? Are we making the right, service balance question? So the journey can continue, but
Yeah.
the benchmarking was sort of conscribed.
Just as a point of reference, there are a couple of communities that either have done that or have gone or are thinking about regionalizing, and it was at least a year-long process to go through all of that and set it up, and it could have been longer in the making. So it's sort of a bigger conversation than we had time to do.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions on this slide? Okay. I think,
I think the next one, yeah,
Valerie, are you
is
doing this one?
Valerie.
Yep.
Okay.
So to try and understand how we are comparing in the school side against our peers, we used the DART districts, which is 10 districts that the Department of Elementary, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education matches to Westford based on our enrollment demographics. So our grade levels, our enrollment size, and the percentage of our subgroups. And we also recently learned that it's industry practice to also compare ourselves to our geographical adjacent districts. So that created a list of 15. And we, for several of these benchmarking analysis, we excluded Concord and Carlisle because they have a very specific setup with municipal elementary schools and then a regional high school. And that was just, again, a time constraint to try and adjust for. So what you're looking at is similar to how Christina used per capita to try to normalize for population. The school data is using the per pupil expenditures to normalize for enrollment. The Department of DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, actually tightly regulates this spending and the reporting out of it. So a lot of this data is really easily accessible and helps make the analysis a little bit quicker, I guess. It does lend itself to being able to trust a little bit of the apples to apples comparisons that's happening. In the administration bucket, so you can see that they're broken down by buckets. They call them function codes. Almost all of them are below median. I also looked at the subcategories inside of these, and there were a couple where we were above average within the subcategories, and a lot of those seem to be a direct link to our district configuration with 9 buildings. So some areas where we have like building-based specific expenses like school leadership, librarians, guidance and adjustment counselors, custodian services, heating, and building security system were all subcategories that were above average, and we think that that is likely due to just the sheer the fact of having 9 buildings in our district. The one area that is above the median is pupil services. I want to clarify that that is not special education. That's actually a breakdown of medical and health services, transportation services, food services, athletics, other student activities and school security. So whereas we have a very healthy engagement with our students for our breakfast and lunch services, that is a self-contained department. And so even though you can see like the expenses coming out through this data set, it doesn't impact our operating budget. But the other areas in that category impacting this above average would be transportation services. And as was said in the earlier slides, we are going out to bid and expect that to go up. And when we went out to bid for this current contract, we received one bid back from our current vendor. So unfortunately, that is not something we have a lot of control over. Just want to make sure. So our total, one thing that's not on this slide is a total per pupil expenditure. So for FY22, Westford's total per pupil expenditure was $17,251, and that is below the median of these 15 DART districts, which was $18,633. So we are the third lowest of those 15 DART districts. And just to clarify again, that these do not incorporate out-of-district expenses, because DESE doesn't put a per pupil data point on out-of-district expenses, since it covers both low-cost school choice placements and high-cost special education placements. So, any questions on that?
Heather?
Does this account for any discrepancies in the way the different towns handle expenses? So, for example, a lot of our capital items wouldn't necessarily have a function code assigned to them, but we do spend quite a bit that way.
So from what I could tell, we do not report our free cash expenditures in this data set. So whereas like another town that might use operating funds for their Chromebooks, they would be higher than us for instructional hardware. But it does try to account for like each like sort of line item is regulated across districts enough that we're looking at the same categories, but if there are differences in how they report or how they fund something.
Right, so for example, if we look at textbook supplies, it's 46% below, but we spend $380,000.
Yes.
That
From
wouldn't be in-
capital.
Would not be in your number.
Correct.
That's really the one thing as we were looking at it that really does kind of jump out, and that's one of the things we did talk about. But when you consider other capital items, other school districts do have building projects and everything, and DESE does consider all of that. It's that we're choosing, specifically the Chromebooks is the best example, right?
Right,
That
right.
we're choosing to support that in a different way, whereas another district, it might be in their operating budget.
And I'm looking a little bit towards the future for the school buses that might be coming before capital, that would be handled the same way.
Right, so like we are, for the second highest in transportation, when I look at the subcategories, and for like the regional districts, they're very low because they're getting so much more help from the state. Or if districts like own their own fleet, then they're much lower.
Also included in the report, and interesting to note, is just what percent of the residents of the town are actually enrolled in the school system. And it's very high in Westford. I don't remember if it's
It was like 19.
yeah, it's like the third highest in our group or something like that, which just goes to say it's often been a mystery, how does Westford do so well with such a low per capita, per student spending? This doesn't answer that mystery, although we know it's because of high quality teaching and high quality engagement with schools from parents and everything else. But for the amount that we allocate out of the budget to schools, which is a very high number, we have a lot of students to support with that number. So, you know, our allocate, it was in the handout, our allocation of our total budget to the schools is high within our benchmark group. So you could say, well, if it's high within our benchmark group, how can our per student be low? It's because we're supporting so many students without allotment compared to other towns, if that makes sense. Just an interesting mechanics of how could this be.
I will say, you've mentioned that before, and I agree with you. But in going through this process, I also found it was interesting that then we said the exact opposite for the Council on Aging. when we were talking about it, when we look at that. And so I think it is part of that when we're looking at how everything, and I'm not saying that one should be moving from one to the other. I'm just saying, we had talked about that first, and I was like, you're right, that's a very interesting piece of the percentage when we look at that, because the 19% is higher than others. But then when we start comparing all of the different things across towns, and you start looking to see what the populations are and how that works out, it then just says, okay, well, I don't know if that's an argument that we want. You know what I'm saying? I'm not sure if it is an interesting way to analyze it and to look at it, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be consistent with how we're looking at everything.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting it's sort of a math nerd, sort of interesting fact that we'd also identified some distant time ago when I was on the school committee. It's just being interesting in terms of mechanics. But you're right, it doesn't dictate policy, it doesn't dictate our priorities, and I would argue, I would say our high level of commitment to our aging community is a real commitment that we've made in a lot of deliberate ways, and so the fact that we have a smaller population, I mean, it's still a totally valid policy choice for us to make.
And I would just add too, one feedback through like the retreat and other conversations I've had since we've started putting this data together is that saying we are low in all these categories is not necessarily pride, right? Like, we're not like bragging about it. Like, this is great, this is where we want to be. It's just a data point, and that was the goal of this task force, was to provide the data as unbiased sort of as we could. So.
Heather?
Just, you know, we're talking about being below, but it is also interesting reading the report that the burden on the taxpayers was on the higher side.
Yeah.
So it is kind of an interesting phenomenon how that all coalesces.
Yeah.
I was just gonna note that one category that we were above with transportation, and correct me if I go out of line because it's not my area of expertise, but I participated in an analysis of all of our bus fees. And so I think sometimes you might look at that and say, okay, we're paying above median to other towns. What could we do with transportation? But I thought it's important to note that we were one of the highest ends of our comparable towns and what we're charging our families for bus fees as is. So there's really not room necessarily. Wouldn't be prudent for us to try to reduce those transportation costs by passing that to the families. I thought that was an important thing. We did a lot of work gathering the bus data.
Scott has a question.
No, that's a Tom made a very good point. If you think about schools which are student heavy because of Westford's demographics. So if you take administration, which is largely a function of having schools, right? So you divide that across a bigger base, you get a lower cost compared to other towns. But teachers, we're pretty much, you know, which are a function of students, and that becomes almost basically on the median.
Yeah.
I suspect that it made the reverse problem for the Council on Aging, that if you've got a below average of the population, when you then divide your social worker, your admin, your vans across a smaller base, you get a higher per capita, but it's not really a function of efficiency, it's a function of fixed costs being divided by a smaller number.
Yeah, you're right. The economy of scale favors our schools because of the high student population, and it works against lower population group like our seniors.
True.
That's a good point. Okay, I think we're good with this slide, unless there are any other questions.
Okay, so back to me. So out of this benchmarking data, we came up with some possible efficiencies that we could look into. One was to invest in energy efficiency improvements for the town and the school buildings, either as part of Amoresco or some other means, so that we can see some savings going forward in our energy costs. The second one is to develop a strategy to reduce Westford's per household solid waste disposal, to be a little bit more in line with the best practice. So Westford is currently about 17% above the state average for putting things out, putting trash out for curbside collection, which means we're also paying a lot more in our tipping costs, because you don't just pay to have that trash collected, you have to pay per ton to have it disposed. So there's kind of a, you know, there's another level there. And Scott, I'll just, you had made a comment in one of the select board meetings about what the per person trash was, and seeing, yeah, because maybe we had more kids, and
Yeah, because I was looking at the, in fact, I got some detail from the Recycling Commission, which I appreciate. And it's, yeah, but if you look at it on the per capita basis, it's a less, we're still above average.
Yep.
But that share drops.
So the only problem with doing it per capita, so I'd be curious to see what data they gave you, because from the DEP data, you only know how many households are being collected. Every municipality doesn't always collect every single household's trash, and so you don't know how many people are in those households. So that's kind of because I went back and said, why didn't I calculate this way? And I went, oh yeah, that's why, because you don't know how many people are in those households that you're collecting. You only know that I'm collecting 8,000 households or whatever.
Lots of apartments versus lots of single-family houses.
Exactly. Yep.
Good point.
Yeah. So moving on, what also came out of this was a review on the policy of the funding level for the recreation department. A lot of peer communities either don't have a recreation department, they've done away with them years ago, or they require that they be fully self-funded. So just something to sort of look into to see what do we want for the rec department. Next is consider consolidating vehicle servicing and fuel versus the current approach, which is pretty much, I think, every department head who has a vehicle in their department is responsible for, getting the oil changed, getting tires changed, whatever you've got to do. Fuel, I believe, for most departments, except for the DPW for sure, is getting their gas from a regular gas station. Okay, but nodding heads, good, I'm getting that right. Versus a lot of our other peer communities, I'll say most of them, because I can't remember if it's quite all, but I feel like it was most of them have their DPW servicing all of their vehicles, both routine maintenance and fuel, with the exception of the special fire apparatus sometimes could not be handled by the DPWs. I'll pause for any questions, but there is just one more slide on this.
Yeah,
I'm just going to make the comment that we already have in place a very nice garage with maintenance equipment. What is it called? We toured it. The highway department, they had a special section that was already equipped and in place. You wouldn't have to invest in infrastructure to make a place to service vehicles.
Yeah, I'm sure there'd be some planning to do, but we've got a super capable group over there, and I think it's worth looking into.
And the facility's great.
Yeah. And I know Steve Cronin has started to look into that a little bit to see what it would take, so I think he's thinking about it.
Yeah.
We'll go on, yep. So facilities, so many of the other peer communities had a sort of one single facilities department that handled all of their buildings, town, school, all of their buildings. And a lot of that included not only like maintenance on the buildings, but custodial. Sometimes they were even responsible for the utilities, just so that there's one expert sort of looking across all of our buildings to maintain them and make sure that they're in good working order. And again, not putting that on potentially a department head who may not be their wheelhouse. Another thing that we noticed was that sort of the counseling and mental health support resources are a little distributed in Westford. There's, we've got a wellness coordinator, we've got we've got another person in the health department, and then there's the social worker at the Cameron Senior Center, and several other peer communities had all of those people sort of collected into one area, one department, so that they could work together and maybe be a little more efficient. And then of course, health insurance is probably one of our bigger bulk, items. And we should just be reviewing that strategy to ensure that it's cost effective as we go forward.
Yeah, I think generally what the town has done is considered an industry best practice. Many or most businesses now have policies like that. I think we're just highlighting it because it's run so much higher than forecast that it leaves us wondering if we did it right. So, worth a close second look.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, if you're self-insured, you've got to float, right? Because we've got this fund, so in a bad year, you pull the fund down, but you can spend 3 years to build it back up. If you've got private insurance, you're going to see the rate increase all at once the following year. So it's worth looking into, but the fact that we had a couple of bad years based upon experience, I'm not convinced we would have gotten a whole lot better off. In fact, maybe even be better off with what we have now than if we'd been in the private sector paying that full experience rating in 1 year.
I think the only other thing that I did notice was maybe a third of the towns were part of a larger group insurance, whether it was GIC through the state or they banded with other towns, you know. That might be the other thing, because I think you're right. Had we had 2 years like this and we were not self-insured, we would have been seeing a 30% premium increase, I bet, you know.
I guess the other question on fuel is, is there a state bid for fuel that we could, because right now we're kind of buying by the gallon for police cars because we pay the market price. If we had some way to, like with salt, get a state bid.
Yeah, so the DPW does fill their tanks through a state bid process, which is, a much more efficient process. So it just would require some additional logistics with getting people key fobs to get up there, filling the tanks a little bit more frequently. But we think we can get over that hurdle rather than the individual departments having what's called a WEX card that give a few cents off a gallon. But as many of you see, fuel in Westford is very expensive compared to some neighboring areas. So we are definitely pursuing and looking into that. But yes, we would be able to buy on a less expensive contract.
Okay, good.
I have a quick question on the
Yep,
health
Heather?
insurance. I saw where things were looked at, but then I was curious, did the premium that we charge our employees get compared, and is that in line?
I don't think
That I don't
I don't think
know.
I don't know if we benchmarked that. You're talking about the amount that the
Right,
employees
so
pay,
like I know I
that they
pay
contribute.
X insurance, I'm curious.
Yeah.
I think when we were talking to some comparable communities, Westford pays 65%, employees pay 35%. A lot of the communities are at 72 to 75% that they're paying of the premium, and the employees paying closer to 27 or 25%.
I'm looking
that what
more
you're
at
talking about?
dollars.
Just
So
the
like,
dollars.
do you charge 1,000 and the town pays 650?
Yeah, it's a little bit
or-
more difficult because the plan designs for each town are so different and unique that it's really hard to compare dollar for dollar related to that.
It's a good question, though. So maybe there is a way to we can put that on our list of things that would be interesting to know. Other questions or comments related to efficiencies? Okay. Christina's actually going to continue with this because she made the first 5 suggestions, so this came out of her research.
So these were sort of ideas that several of us had as we went through our research. Mine kind of came out of, I looked at 22 other towns' budgets, and some of them I was like, oh, this is really cool. I love the way they do this, So these were sort of things that weren't exactly going to save us any money or generate any money, but just interesting ways or more, just better ways to communicate certain things, I guess. So a couple of them are, the first bullet is enhanced budget communication. And Lexington, and there was another town also, but within each department, they would actually list revenue sources. So Dan's going to pull up an example. But it was sort of nice to see, just gave it a little bit of a rounder picture. I mean, in some departments it's going to make a little more sense than others, but it showed grants, it showed if there were any fees that were running through this department, if there were revolving funds. So this is the DPW. Yep, this is the DPW for Lexington. And if you look at that top block, you'll see tax levy. So that's how much is coming from taxes. They've got enterprise funds there. It's whatever revenue is coming from that. And then they've got several different fees. Now, Lexington's a little bit different because it looks like they're taking those parking fees, those cemetery prep fees, those kinds of things, and they're actually using it to offset their DPW budget. We don't do that accounting-wise. So I think ours would look a little bit different, but it's still sort of interesting to look and see, oh, the cemetery's bringing in X number of dollars per year, licenses and permits are bringing in whatever, and I think further down, it probably not in the DPW, but if there are departments that had revolving funds or grants, they would list those as well. We can go back to the other thing. Actually, if you just want to go straight to that Westboro one, Dan. So the next piece that I thought was sort of interesting was Westboro's budget. Each department had like a little table of performance metrics. Whatever made sense to them. So this is Westboro's police department, and they've got, a history, some estimates, and then history of a couple years. Just different metrics that kind of make sense for the police. So you've got number of calls for service, so you can kind of look and say, oh, look at that, it's increasing. This makes sense that maybe they're asking, I think they were asking for more officers, number of arrests, number of, whatever. And each department had what would be applicable to their department. So it was just an interesting look at their workload and kind of the things that may be increasing for them over time. And then if we go back to the slide. Sorry, I don't remember what the next bullet was. Okay. Another idea was to hold a budget kickoff meeting with the school committee, the finance committee, and the select board, maybe sometime in early September, just so that all the three boards can be sort of on track as the budget process starts. I think it might have been Lexington again that did that, and there've been a couple of them.
And part of our conversation there was about the budget, the select board budget policy document that gets approved in September-ish, right? And just having the three boards jointly look at that.
Because finance committee usually looks at it before a select board does, but school committee doesn't have any input into that, so there's nothing to kind of join how the money gets parceled out later. Another thing was just to rename some of the budget categories to be a little more descriptive. So, there's this great category called unclassified, which everyone's like, what the heck is that? And, it's essentially health insurance. But to call some of those things like health insurance that goes across the entire town, even debt service, there were several towns that called those shared expenses, and then they sort of listed those just to have it make a little more sense to the average person. I think it took me a little while to remember what unclassified was. The other thing was to routinely survey peer communities on major contracts and expenses, just to see what other people are doing and what deals they may be getting.
And this was highlighted in the solid waste contract. Basically, because Christina was out looking for what are other communities doing, she noticed that E.L. Harvey had not even bid for our contract when they were the low-cost selectee in Chelmsford, I think.
Yeah, Chelmsford.
So it's a good thought then to say next time we're bidding one of these major things, let's make sure all the good candidates have an opportunity to bid, because we're now actually very likely changing D.L. Harvey and saving $1 million or something. So having a practice like that in place when we don't have a seated budget task force, could save us a lot of money.
I think to Scott's point too, we realized towards the end that Chelmsford just put in a composting program for their residents. So I think we passed that information to Kristen. So just really taking these big picture items to our peer communities and saying, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Have you done this? Or we think you've done this. Who have you used? And making sure we're doing best practices.
Even if we didn't pick Harvey, the very fact that you've got one more competitor in the mix can lower the cost because of the bid strategies. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, our second best option came down a lot.
Yeah.
So in response to this new entry.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so moving on, capital, we really didn't have enough time to really dig into capital, but we're suggesting that a 5 to 10 year capital forecast get created, probably through the capital planning committee, and to figure out how we can sort of take care of our delayed maintenance and investments going forward, because there's quite the backlog of capital projects.
Yeah, I think the concern here is that our practice is, like, here's what we can afford, and so we'll do that, and there could be this accumulating delayed maintenance inventory that could be generating some real risk for future budget periods, and we don't really have a good way to look at that now, based on the way we do things. So the idea would be, if we could see that whole picture, we may say, okay, we need to, move some of these things forward to be efficient long-term. So it's sort of a suggestion, I think, to a new process there with the capital committee, and certainly want the capital committee's input on what's manageable, what's efficient, what can make sense there.
Mm-hmm. The next thing that Shayna noticed as she was going through is that we don't have a comprehensive list of town-owned land that was easily accessible. So it would just it would just be easier if we were looking through to see, what do we own, I don't know if you want to add any more to that, but.
Yeah, we have a list, it's 300 and something properties that we own, but no one was able to quantify for me, like, details of those properties. What is ripe for development, what might have land restrictions, what might have zoning restrictions or conservation restrictions. So when I was trying to figure out, of the 300 properties, are any of them viable to sell, or any of them viable to development, we couldn't really answer that question. So I think, while we may not be looking currently to offload or sell a town-owned property, being prepared to be able to say, especially we're talking about economic development, do we have any properties that might be ripe for economic development? And we just don't have that information. So I think to be able to take those 300 and something properties and be able to classify them, these ones are development, these ones aren't, these ones could be for sale, these ones aren't, these are in zoning restrictions that make them less than appealing, would be in our best interest, just so we have that readily available for us.
So the next thing is special education expenses, and as was talked about earlier, it can be highly variable, right? It's 14% increase, and then the following year it's going to be 4%, where it used to be 3%. I mean, a student moves into town, and you're all of a sudden, it's just all over the place. So we thought it would be really advantageous to just highlight that variable nature of that, sort of discrete expense, and possibly highlight it at the outset of the budget.
Yeah, I'll just add that, like, one thing we talked about was that it's almost similar, it's this like shared town expense, right? Like OPEB, or like a mandatory thing that comes off the top. And it makes budgeting the school operating budget difficult, because most of our expenses can grow by a reasonable projected amount. But that category can just be really hard to project out, so.
I guess I had a question, this is based on my own experience, right? So my daughter was special needs. Dr. Dwyer at the time was the SPED director. He said, first of all, I encourage you to go see what's out there for third-party programs, but there are 2 other then girls similar to your daughter, and we were prepared to put together a program for all 3 of them. And in the end, all 3 families thought it was the best thing, and the town saved a fortune, because rather than 3 placements, you had one instructor. I guess, to what degree do we have the flexibility within the school department to look at sort of like needs and create an internal program as opposed to outsourcing it all?
I actually think we're doing that all the time, right? That is something that we're always looking at. We are developing new programs when they arise, if we think that we can meet that need. I think that's a really good example. The other piece to this is also just, I don't remember how many years ago when the school committee first established the Special Education Stabilization Fund, 4 or 5, something like that. We haven't been able to build that up to where it could be, because that's the other thing that we're looking at, is that similar to even the healthcare conversation that we're having. Like, ideally, if that was I think a healthier fund, then that in itself could help absorb that variability that changes each year, and we could have a more predictable special education.
To your original question, there in the report there is mention of like a post-grad program
Yep.
for ages 18 to 22. That's an area that we think could lead to a better service being offered and a reduction in out of placements. But some of those require a little bit of initial investment, so they're not as easy to sort of talk about as an efficiency, right? Because for example, a bigger example is some of the building level expenses. You could find some efficiency if you build one bigger building and have less smaller buildings, right? So it gets a little bit tricky, but yeah, some things need an investment to be able to do.
So I'll just finish this up quickly. So the list of comparable towns that we used, I know on the municipal side, that list is, maybe 20 years old. It's just historically been used. The school list is kind of changed with DESE and, sort of. So we just wanted to sort of put it out there that, we did not look at those lists and determine that they were still valid. We didn't have time. We thought trying to go through and create our own potentially new list was just not it was not a good way to spend our time. But since everything stems from those benchmarks, or a lot of it stems from that benchmarks, we just think that we may want to take the town may want to take some time to look at those lists, make sure they still make sense, tweak them if necessary, and just to make sure that we're starting at a good starting point. And of course, just to continue to build on the good practices in Westford, because there are a lot of good things. We sort of harped on the things that needed to be changed here, but there were certainly a lot of good things going on that we did find.
And I'll add to that too, that I feel like we see all the time headlines of deficits in other municipalities or in other school districts, and a lot of times it comes from choices that are made that I don't think are happening in Westford for good reason, right? Like that with all the federal grants, using them to fund positions, and then towns find themselves with that fiscal cliff. And that's not why we're having this conversation, right? This wasn't like self-created. So I wanted to make sure we highlighted that.
Yeah, and just to give an example for people who might be watching this, so there's been a very deliberate and thoughtful architecture to migrate the different groups that used to be providing services into what is now our Department of Public Works. That took several years. There was a lot of planning. It ended up being a big success in terms of both service providing and cost efficiency. So there have been some excellent practices I think we can offer to other towns that we've done here. But as mentioned, those don't tend to come up as often in this kind of study. We tend to say, okay, great, let's check that off as being well done and look for the next opportunity. Any questions on observations of continuous improvement opportunities? We're sort of offering these up, as the committee is offering these up to the various boards to consider. Okay. So this committee, in terms of submitting the report, has largely met the charter. There's a couple things that we thought might be useful that we could tack on as sort of additional activities or tasks. And it's really, there's an opportunity for you to tell us if you think this is worth our time or not. So one thing would be to try to prepare some public communication, public education, short videos around some of these things to help give the boards, whoever is sort of tackling the next phase in planning and communication, some tools that they could use to try to manage this pretty complicated public education task. So you've seen things like this before. We'd partner with WestfordCAT and try to boil down some of these key points with some graphics to try to make it easy to understand, easy to send out as links. Another thing we could do is this committee will continue to be, it's impaneled through and past spring town meeting already. That's baked in. So one thing we could do before that is, if you asked us to, we could prepare an update on the action items. So if you just thought it's interesting accountability mechanism, we'd like to know of all the recommendations we made, were some acted on, were they not acted on, what's the status? You could ask this committee to come back and then sort of re-interview and say, what have you done with what we've offered up as ideas? those are two things. There could be other things too. Members of the committee expect to be available if there are needs for communication around the work that was done. So if some event came up in the future, or if a town meeting had ended up being valuable, the committee would certainly be available to present the work done and the findings. So let me ask first if there's other needs or desires from the task force, and specifically, would these two things be useful? Is one useful, not the other, neither? How do people feel? Scott?
So, I mean, one of the best things this time of did was the Show Me the Money, I think, that Elizabeth did once upon a time, and also the video for the wastewater treatment, for the water fee. But I'm actually wondering if, ideally, this is seen by the public, and it informs them, but also it inspires someone to say, hey, I'm interested in logistics. Have you thought about this? So, and also, I think the appetite for half-hour videos is pretty small. So, is it an option to create perhaps 5 or 6, and one focuses on education, one's on waste, one is on public works? I mean, I don't know how it would break up, but a series of smaller, specialized ones as opposed to one long one.
I think that's a great idea, and that is sort of along the lines of what we're thinking, is that we'd have probably one on benchmarking and try to keep them short enough to be manageable. So I think 3 to 5 minutes is already pretty long for a video, so maybe even shorter than that. And just try to get the key point out and direct people with links back to more detailed information if they want it. That's sort of the idea. Any other reactions to it being useful or valuable to create something along the lines of what Scott's talking about? Yep, Heather?
I'm just curious, does anyone know on videos like that? I know that Elizabeth was pretty popular, but do the townsfolks actually watch them? Is there any statistic on that?
WestfordCAT does track views, and most of these have been done in that way. In some cases, I don't know what the range is, but in some cases it's hundreds of views. In some cases it's dozens of views. So there's a possibility here that that some of them may only be used to educate 20 or 30 more people than have engaged so far. I would think that's probably worth our time, even if it is that low, and I think some would be higher, probably.
I think just to add to that, Tom and I did an interview on Friday, and Valerie did last week as well, with the ghostwriters of Westford Academy, and really getting this information out to the high school and middle school students to then get the information to their parents. And they were telling us, we don't read things really, we like to watch videos. So if we're going to be catering to all populations, videos is just one mechanism to do that.
In that same vein, did you have a lot of participation in your open sessions that were not the retreat?
The retreat, we had a lot of participation by design. The others were not very highly attended. I will say a number of people came up to me at the retreat who'd been watching our budget task force meetings, which was great to hear. And then I went back and checked the views, and some of them have 50 views or 60 views. So 50 or 60 residents took the time to actually watch an hour of us discussing how we're analyzing data. So you'd love it to be thousands, but I think even if it's dozens, that's still a useful service, in my opinion. Okay, I'm going to interpret. I'm going to interpret that there is some appetite for this video, and we'll take that on and think more about it. How about the second one? This is certainly not needed. It was just an idea that came up in one of the meetings. We can certainly hold our own, folks directly accountable for these things, and we don't need a summary way to do it necessarily, but it's something we could do. Any strong feelings on that?
I think it'd be very useful to get a follow-up on what was implemented and how that might have changed.
Okay.
Especially for the FinCom members who are going through the budget. I mean, it's quick and dirty. They're not going to analyze it, I don't think. I mean.
Well, it's difficult because the volume is so high.
Exactly. So I think if it was put in front of somebody, they're more likely to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Scott?
Well, I think there's a piece missing in the middle, which is not your task force problem, but there's a report, there is a set of recommendations, and then there's a follow-up on the action status. But that's the different department heads, right? That
Mm-hmm.
we put them into practice. So I guess as opposed to action status, sort of what's that dialogue look like between what would work and what wouldn't work? Because some things won't work because they won't work. Some things won't work because there's not a real drive to do it. And I guess I'm kind of curious to know yeah, we ticked off what worked, but why? So that kind of process, I think, is kind of missing here. And I know, I'm sure Dr. Chu and Chris will do that with the staffs, but, you know, as this broader committee, we might want to, you know, be aware of what's happened there too.
Yeah. Yeah, so we could sort of fold this into the budget process when we have a forum where most of these people are together looking at each basically department presenting, and we could highlight, you know, you did have a budget task force recommendation that looked like this. How are you thinking about it? That might be a way to break it apart and do it. Okay, why don't we think about that a little bit more? It sounds like that's not as straightforward. Well, Heather thinks it's a good idea. Let's think about how we want to do that. And so whether it's one event or it's sprinkled into the reviews that we already have planned, we'll think about, get some input and figure out the best way to do an accountability check of some sort. Any other questions for the budget task force? Because I do want to take just a minute, even though we're at the end of time, to talk about sort of at least the conversation that the joint chairs had about what might be next in terms of budgeting, which is a policy board discussion, not a budget task force thing. Okay. Anything online?
Nothing online, no.
Okay. So as you know, developing budgets is an enormous undertaking for town staff and everyone involved, so we want to be as clear about what we're asking for as possible as early as we can. We basically have to develop one budget where the revenue line is in the traditional Prop 2.5 plus new growth constraint. We have to know that because it could be that that's the only thing that the voters in the town are interested in doing. And that plan will have dramatic service cuts. We talked about it in the document. We didn't talk about it tonight. But if you're talking about, I mean, I don't want to give you a number that'll stick in your head forever, but if you're thinking about like 5, 6, 7% cuts to accommodate these high growing costs that are really largely outside of our control, that's going to be a deep cut. That's going to affect a lot of services. It's going to affect class size. It's going to affect extracurricular access. It's going to affect things like how many police officers we have in the street. We'll have to revisit a lot of the choices that we've made about how we do public safety coverage, which was a project that Scott and I worked on a long time ago, and I think we've gotten to a good place in terms of service level, but we're just not going to be able to maintain the service level if we're trying to pay for all these, you know, high growth increases that within the Prop 2.5 constraints. So one budget I think we're duty bound to prepare is that budget. So this is a budget that will have a lot of service cuts, but will live within the Prop 2.5 new growth revenue increase constraint. I also think that it would benefit us and benefit the voters to have a choice between that plan and another plan, which would include probably some level of service cuts, probably some efficiency gains, but would probably include an override amount to lessen or mitigate the service reductions or let people target maintaining services where they consider them most important. So what we talked about in the joint chairs meeting is not committing to do an override. We're not ready to do that because we don't understand what the numbers are. We haven't evaluated these trade-offs. We haven't thought about these service levels. But to make it part of the budget process to have two budgets basically being created in parallel. One would be, again, traditional budgeting with what we know will be a very high level of service cuts. The other would be one we would reach over time in conversation, which would be probably, we've said, this is the point where we think the Westford residents are not well served by these revenue cuts. So we are proposing a plan that would include, we would consider developing a plan that included an override. So people would basically have two choices come to town meeting. And they could either choose to increase taxes on themselves, which is painful, but that would be the best way to keep a lot of the services that we've grown used to here in town. Or they may say that's not our priority, we want to go the other way and we'll accept the service trade-offs and stay within the Prop 2.5 constraint. So that is the budget direction to the people doing all the budgeting work that we had discussed in the joint chairs meeting. At least I feel from a policy point of view, I feel like we have to give the voters that choice. I don't feel like we can decide for them to accept this dramatic level of service cuts, and I don't think we can decide for them that the only path forward that we can present is something that includes an override. I think we have to have both. So I don't know if other folks have a reaction to that, but we can also take this forward in our individual boards going forward and talk about how we think that's going to work specifically. But that's, I think, what we talked about, and I think that would serve the interests and give the most choice to the residents.
Talk a little bit about, excuse me, a little bit about the timeline that you see.
So backing up from the warrant, by January, early January, we'll have to have decided we'll have to have made a commitment that either we are or not going to pursue an override, and we'll have to have some description of exactly what we're talking about. And then sort of developing that plan and what specifically are we talking about in this balance of service trade-offs and override money. I think we would have to develop that, in between now and early December, probably, to have the working room that we need. And I'm signing you up for something. What do you guys think? And Chris, what does your team think in terms of timing?
Yeah, so we are presenting the fiscal year 25 budget to the select board on December 12th. So we need some direction on, are we preparing one budget with the cuts, or are we preparing two to present at that time, or are we doing some sort of hybrid? But I think between now and the beginning of November, we should get some guidance from our policy boards on that.
Yeah, Scott?
Well, it's related to a separate issue, which is how are we communicating with our employees? Because they all know there's a budget shortfall, and they all know that there's choices here, and I don't want good people being scared and leaving. So how are we communicating this to our employees, that there's this thoughtful approach that hopefully doesn't involve pain, but we can't guarantee that?
Yeah, so I know that I've been communicating to our department heads on at least a monthly basis, if not more, on my one-on-ones, that, the Budget Task Force is going to be presenting their report. Please stay tuned to that. We're not making any decisions at this point in time. We're really presenting facts and options. When there comes a time where the select board has more guidance, I want to be there every step of the way with the employees to provide them with the factual information so that they are on the same track. I don't know if Dr. Chu has a similar.
We have, after each of the different updates that the Budget Task Force has done, like when we did one in the summer, and then even after the retreat, we've been communicating with our leadership, and Valerie and I actually met with the unions as well too, to share just where we were at as those things have become public, to then sort of remind people this is the information that we're looking at. As far as developing two budgets, that is sort of what our assumption was, right? That we were going to be needing to do, and that timeline is, other than the fact that you're doing two, that timeline is the timeline that we would have been following. So I feel like it is just that question of really being able to articulate what these two options potentially look like.
Yeah, just to acknowledge, developing two is almost like doing twice as much work, especially on topics this sensitive. So it is a huge ask to staff to do this, but I can't think of another way to do it. Any other discussion on that? And I don't know, Diane, if that sort of answers your question in an oblique way.
It does, and I think the two budgets is a great idea for options for the community.
Okay.
My opinion.
Okay.
It's a good strategy to have something in your back pocket or have a question.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. Yep, Heather?
I know sometimes in the budget process, if you don't have it the one year and you don't spend it, you don't get it the next year. But I do think that it would be wise to encourage the main budget without any cuts to be as lean as possible. I know one group got rid of a service contract. I think it was the assessors, so they're cut. I'm going to bring it up at Capitol tomorrow, but pulling out those police cruisers and treating them like capital frees up budget dollars that somebody else could use. And if we're going to do that, that would be the similar way we'd want to handle any school vehicle purchases to be consistent. So.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It's something I should have mentioned. So in the joint chairs meeting, we also discussed that there's this sort of Prop 2.5 constrained budget. There's just a straight sort of level services budget that we probably want to forecast, which would include the expected cost increase on all the items that we haven't talked about. And probably the plan we're targeting is in between those two. We probably are going to say, we don't want to just do everything the same way we've always done and just sort of say it just costs more and we're going to pay it. We do need to go through and further exploit savings and ask hard questions about service levels, because there are some places that we're providing higher service levels than other places. Do we want to do that by policy or not? So another visual in your mind is there's this sort of base plan that would be extremely painful and would directly affect us in a lot of ways. And then there's this, what if we just rolled everything forward, doing the same thing the way we always did? And then the plan we're searching for is in between the two. It's, I'm not sure like the distance between them, but it's somewhere in between the two, because it has to ask all those hard questions. So I almost wonder if that will end up being part of the communication ultimately is, we're not putting forward that we're just, well, costs are up, we're just gonna pay it with no analysis. That's what it would look like if we did this, and our plan is actually like this. It's lower than that for a bunch of good reasons, and, there are some hard trade-offs even in what we're presenting. We just don't feel like, we feel like you have to have the option to choose that instead of something much more draconian.
And something you just mentioned kind of was one of my next comments is that we should make sure that we do bring in some monies from the revolving accounts, that I know some of them have historically grown over time. And for instance, the road and bush revenue, I have no idea where that gets used. I don't know what the account balance is, but I mean, somehow, similar to what Christina showed us, where some of these departments are showing the net line, like maybe that stuff needs to regularly be included in the budget process. So I'm making up numbers. If you get $50,000 a year, you're putting 25 against your expenses every year.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm not sure what the mechanism of transfer would be, whether it gets transferred to free cash or whatever, but I think the point, I understand the point, which is make sure we're not letting some unused balance just build up unobserved.
Right.
Okay.
I guess the only thing that I'll sort of add on to that is sort of option C or B, I'm not sure which number we're up to, but, we came up with a lot of recommendations and a lot of efficiencies and, ideas, but our department heads know their departments really, really well, and there may be other things that they know of, different ways to do things that we wouldn't be able to figure out as an outsider. So it would be interesting to hear from them if there's anything that they know of that could help out.
Yeah, I think as part of the budget process, maybe we have a standing question, which is there something you've observed or just noticed from your own work or know from peers? I think that would be a good question to ask.
Yeah, that was actually a question I did ask in the initial, but I've met with all the department heads. What have you traditionally asked for that you don't think you need anymore? Or what have you traditionally asked for that you don't get funded that you feel that you need, and asking innovative questions. But we'll dig a little bit deeper into that question as well along the process.
John?
I have a resident question, so
Okay.
pretend I'm Shanna Farnsworth of 83 Groton Road. So given the fantastic work the Budget Task Force has done, and the timeline of which the Select Board and the other committees need to make determinations about overrides, what's the process for each board to look at some of the suggestions and some of the efficiencies and figure out how and if some of these can be incorporated into this budget cycle, things that could be saving money that would help offset either cuts or an override dollar amount?
Well, one idea that we were just sort of talking about a little bit is, so what's coming up is when we do the detailed department reviews is, like, we're all in a room, used to be with big thick binders, now it's online, and you basically are going through line by line by line. And one thing we could do is we could pull out the Budget Task Force prompt questions and make sure that they're on the agenda for each department when they present. So when the fire department presents, we could emphasize, hey, look, you had a recommendation, which is periodic review of ambulance fees. Has that been baked into your process? And so it would be a chance to sort of spread those out and ask them directly. That's one way we could do it, and I'll be interested to know with everyone how else we may want to do it. But just in conversation tonight, that is one way we could make sure all the questions get asked and answered in a process that we already have. Yep, Erica?
Just a couple of thoughts, and this is, I'm just grappling with this now too. I hadn't really thought about this ahead of time, but going into this is going to be very difficult for the departments, and obviously, I guess a two-pronged process question is, like, what sort of guidance might there be other than, an even cut percentage across? Because there may be, just from a public service perspective, unevenness dictated. But what are the rules that would dictate that unevenness? And I don't know what that is, but it sure seems like that would be something that we would want to define ahead of time before Kristen has to go up and ask department heads just the generic question, what can we do better? I mean, that we tried that, and that's just not
Yeah.
good starter. And then the other part of this process question is, once we get to mid-December, how do you guys make this decision? Like, what's the threshold of pain that, I mean, obviously, it's going to be painful to envision a world where we have to make these drastic cuts. So what's the threshold where you decide yes versus no? I mean, I would say it's important to think about that ahead of time, whether you document it or think about it personally, but I guarantee when you get into December, it's, you know,
Right.
having not thought about it ahead of time just seems like a really bad plan.
Right. So two questions. One is, if you really had to make the kind of cuts we're talking about, you wouldn't just peanut butter it and, you know, say, okay, everyone do 4%. You would say, okay, what's feasible here? What affects public service? What affects life and safety? And you do this. So, Chris, I know you've thought about that with Dan. I don't know if you want to describe that or if you feel like it's, I mean, not the specifics, but just how are you thinking about it, I guess?
Yeah, and I'll share it tonight because I did share it with the department heads this morning in our department head meeting, is that it will not be a straight, whatever it is, 4, 5, 6% cut across all departments. It will be weighing the pros and cons of the safety of the town of Westford, the priorities of the town of Westford, what are the nice to have things that we currently have that won't affect, you know, the life and safety of people who live here on an everyday basis. So there will be very hard decisions, but it will not be a straight across the board, and it won't be you get a 4, you get a 6, you get an 8. It's more of going to be a seesaw based upon those observations and the conversations that we have.
And then to the second question of, we're going to try to come up with some idea of like what level of service cuts is not in the interest of the town of Westford. So how do we do that? I think we're going to end up talking about that sort of in detail, almost line by line, because in the end we need to come up with this plan that's not just same thing as yesterday, not the draconian one, but the middle one. So what's in that? I think that is going to be the hard work of the next 6 weeks, and I don't think we have a simple answer for that right now. I wouldn't want to speculate right now. I mean, I think historically we have heard, and also in the town retreat, we heard some priorities expressed over and over and over again as being core to the town and core to the resident needs. So I think those we'd be much more likely to recommend maintaining a service level in. But yeah, I think that's going to be the work here, is for us to find a way that as boards, we've sort of reached a determination of where we think that really difficult line is. So.
And the school department might have the same philosophy or might work it a little bit differently, so I don't want to exclude them from the conversation either.
I was just going to say that I feel like you'd already mentioned it earlier too. I mean, we have certain policies in place. We have values that we've already identified, both on the town and within the school department. And so those are going to be the first things that you're going to be looking at, you know, to see whether what is sustainable and what is not sustainable. But
There obviously there will be a very specific answer to that question. I just feel like tonight we're just starting, so I'm not quite. Right. I don't want to lean on anybody to try to throw out a number. Any other reflections on just what we're doing now from the budget process from here? What we think we're doing. We'll continue to have the joint chairs meetings, which I think are very useful. So the frequency of those will be, you know, at least monthly. If we get right in the heat of something, it may be more often because we're all one team and there's all kinds of crossover effects we need to be thinking about. Yeah, I think those are the building blocks of what will happen from here. Okay, last call for questions. I mean, this has been a full night, so, and I do want to thank again. I don't know, there will be a time that the Budget Task Force is all together again, but I just do want to thank everyone again for all their hard work. It was just a really tremendous effort. And if you're watching this meeting, at least just read the first couple pages. You may get hooked. It's just, if you're at all a budget person, it's just interesting. So yeah.
I think I know the answer because I know where interest rates are, where they have been. But we have there's one big block we've discussed, which is debt.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can do on restructuring that to lower the cost for 2 years and make up someplace else? We don't have a two-year acute problem and a longer-term shorter problem.
We can definitely look at debt, but interest rates are
Yeah,
going up
exactly.
still. So, yeah, we don't really have anything we can refinance at this point in time either.
Yeah, a good piece of the equation. Yep.
Can I
Sharon.
have a resident closing thought?
Okay.
As one of the residents on the task force, I don't know who will watch this out in the audience, but I found, as somebody that hasn't been super involved when my child was young in town government and what's been going on, that this exercise has given me a lot of insight into what's happening into the town. And to Tom's point, reading the first few pages is great. I think, Dan, you put together a lot of comparable community data in the first 5 or 6 pages of our report about our, how we compare to other towns with our housing prices, our tax prices, and where we fall there. And I found that a lot of that data really gave me more insight into the things that you hear that are going on, whether it's in social media or in chitter chatter with your moms when we're having coffee and throwing our kids in the playground so we can have mom play dates. And that gave me a lot of good insight, I think, into misnomers that I've heard about where we are in terms of comparable communities and things like that. So I know it's 100 pages, I know it's a lot of stuff, but if you're out there and you're listening and you're willing to read through, I think if you want to become a little bit more educated on the town, I found that for me personally, it gave me a lot of really good insight. And I think there were people that are really ingrained in the town here and on the committee that found a lot of really helpful information there. So if you're here and you're listening somewhere, I plead to take a few minutes and at least read some of those few benchmark pages, because there's a real lot of good information there that can help, especially as we come up as a town, maybe having some really hard choices. So that's my resident.
And maybe that little fact could be the first little 2-minute video that we decide to stress, because there's just a lot of misunderstanding about what the traditional allocation's been, how it's changed over time, what level of support Westford's shown for schools versus public safety. I mean, it's just all laid out there in such a clear way. I think that's something we could do now, is just focus on getting people to understand the fact so we can build from there. Because right now, you can't have a conversation about this stuff if people have a different set of facts they're starting from. So it's a great point and a good thing to prioritize soon. Okay. That might be it. Nothing from
we're
there?
dropping
Okay.
attendees, so.
Well, with a lot of gratitude, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? I guess we can adjourn all as a board,
We
right?
can all adjourn.
Does that count? Thanks, everybody.